Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we've discontinued our in-person events and instituted these online webinars. Without our previous revenue-generating programs, we now depend on your donations to support the webinars and to be able to continue to pay our Mexican staff. You can donate at our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. And for you Canadians, center is spelled C-E-N-T-E-R. Today, we have a very special event honoring the memory of Leo Panitch, who unexpectedly died last month from COVID. He was a giant in the international left community and is missed by many, many people. I have admired his prodigious writings. I mean, it's incredible how much he's written and published over the years. I can't claim to have read more than a fraction of it, but everything that I have read has been so insightful and instructive that it has stayed with me. Today we have two of his colleagues at York University and collaborators who have written and published with him in various ways. Here are, I'm just trying to put up here a screen of two of the more recent publications. The current issue of the Socialist Register, which Leo worked with Greg Alpo on for many years, and the Socialist Challenge Today, in which Stephen Maurer was a co-author. Both Stephen and Greg are with us today. They will talk about Leo, his ideas, his life, his contribution. And after that, we will then play the webinar talk that Leo did for the Center for Global Justice this last summer. Following that, then there will be opportunity for others to ask questions or to make comments. But let me turn the floor over now to Leo's friends and collaborators, Stephen Maurer and then Greg Alpo.
Thanks, Cliff. Yeah, there's no doubt that for me, and as for many others, certainly Leo's family as well, obviously, the world feels quite a bit darker since his passing. He was my teacher, supervisor, very close comrade and close friend for a decade. I was his final PhD student, a very unfortunate designation. And it has been an honor and a privilege for me to collaborate as assistant editor for the Socialist Register for the past 9 years. It is still hard for me to believe that he's gone. Up until his last days, we were exchanging emails, debating and discussing the political crisis in the US, the future of the far right and the Republican Party, and the nature of the escalating political crisis that was even building already at that time. And obviously, with the events of recent weeks, with the siege of the Capitol and so on in the United States, so many times since Leo has died, I wanted to call or write to him to discuss the situation. Agree or disagree with Leo, I always found it so clarifying and so illuminating to interact with him and to talk with him. And it's hard for me, to the extent that it's hard for me now to separate my own ideas and my own views from those which I developed in conversation with Leo. Throughout his life, Leo devoted himself to demonstrating the necessity of a democratic socialist politics that could transcend both the limits of social democracy and old-style communist parties, like the vanguard party model. In this, he followed his mentor, Ralph Miliband, one of the pioneers of Marxist state theory. Just as the vanguardist parties, the Leninist parties, had failed to build a substantial base in the working class, anything like what would have been necessary to stage an insurrection and overthrow the state and the kind of political theories that are advanced by those milieus. On the other hand, social democratic parties had become mechanisms for disciplining the working class and limiting their political horizons to what was possible within capitalism. Social democratic parties had become top-down institutions which ultimately relegate workers to a passive role and pursue a politics of class compromise. So they constrain the political horizons for working classes within what's possible within capitalism. And they also relegate workers to a kind of passive role in supporting elite or technocratic leaders of those social democratic parties, that they have no real say in a kind of proactive way in developing the party platform or struggling in ways that go beyond these kind of knocking on doors, making phone calls, and so on for those candidates. With together with the marginalization of socialist forces in these parties, whose ideas were seen as unrealistic, etc., Leo, he analyzed how, especially in his great essay, The Impasse of Social Democratic Politics in the 1985-86 Register, how the removal of barriers to free capital mobility and financial integration globally were already leading to the undoing of these distributional bargains based on social democratic class compromises in these contexts, and leading to the unraveling and new pressures on working classes in those societies to reduce their wages and to engage in more precarious forms of labor. So for Leo, the only real option is to go further, to go beyond social democracy and to transcend the limits of social democratic politics. He was fond of quoting the famous political scientist Michel's iron law of oligarchy, which held that however democratic their internal organization may be, political parties will inevitably become dominated by an elite group. So the fundamental task then is to find a way to overcome this iron law of oligarchy, to construct a party of a different kind, neither along the lines of the vanguardist models or the social democratic model. A party of a different kind that was organized predicated not on the passivity of workers, but rather premised on developing the democratic capacities of workers to struggle and to push beyond the limits of what was possible within capitalist society, such that when a capitalist crisis arrived, rather than simply roll back whatever reforms had been won, as had happened after the crisis of the 1970s, supported by the social democratic parties, workers would be prepared to struggle further towards something new, toward a fundamentally new society. I co-authored with Sam Ginden, another unfortunate designation that I unfortunately have. I co-authored with Sam Ginden Leo's last Socialist Register essay, which appeared in the 2020 volume and served as the basis for many of the additions that we made to the revised and expanded version of the Socialist Challenge Today that Cliff mentioned in the beginning. These were both very, very difficult to write, due both to the immense contradictions in these projects themselves. So Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, Bernie Sanders in the US, and Syriza in Greece, as well as the contradictions in our own political and intellectual commitments. The fundamental puzzle that we tried to address was, given that we are now in a period in which large-scale transformative change is impossible, at the same time, small steps short of the big change that we so earnestly seek and so desperately need, small steps risk getting swallowed up by the system. So how to find a way forward in the midst of this paradox. Large steps are impossible. Small steps risk being swallowed up and amounting to very little or nothing. The failure to immediately put seizing the means of the production on the agenda by Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders, et cetera, was not due to their own individual cowardice, but the constraints that these individuals were facing. And they are indeed just individuals without parties or extensive organizational support behind them. Indeed, the unexpected coming to the fore of Sanders and Corbyn in the US and the UK and the movements around them was the result not so much of the strength of labor or the left, but rather a symptom of the weakness of the center. And this crisis of the center was of a particular and very narrow kind. Neoliberalism had been widely delegitimated in the sense that people didn't like it and didn't think that it was going to lead to a better world as it once was so credibly able to promise in the 1990s. But despite this unpopularity and delegitimization, neoliberalism remained institutionally entrenched, even despite all the dysfunction in the ideological apparatuses and the mechanisms of representation like the media and the political parties. So despite this dysfunction, represented, of course, above all else by Donald Trump, neoliberalism remains institutionally entrenched in the state. So the kind of crisis that allowed for Sanders and Corbyn in the US and UK to come to the fore was a very narrow kind. They allowed for the expression of this discontent within this deadlock in both the US and UK cases of the two-party system at a time when the left had very little independent political infrastructure to build from. So insofar as these forces and the movement upsurge and creative organizing that they inspired were generating a return to class struggle, most importantly in the shift from protest to politics, as Leo called it, he wanted to be supportive of these movements. He wanted to be supportive of these projects and these efforts. And yet all three of us wanted to seriously identify the limits of the programs put forward by Sanders and Corbyn, as well as in Greece, and to identify as well the limits of what could be achieved working within these center-left parties, not to mention working within capitalist states. So not only did they not have the support of a party apparatus, they also were working on the hostile terrain of a capitalist state. So the odds, to say the least, were stacked against them in all three cases. So the question we tried to answer was, did the small steps being put forward by Corbyn and Sanders actually represent steps at all? Could they constitute a meaningful break with neoliberalism and offer a stepping stone on which to build future struggles towards socialism? Or did the programs that were put forward simply reduce to different forms of stakeholder capitalism, not substantively different than what's being put forward by Elizabeth Warren, or even in some cases Davos, albeit clothed with some more radical rhetoric? Ultimately, we showed in the essay and in the book the limits to what was being proposed, and suggested that what was really significant about Corbyn and Sanders, as well as Syriza, were not the policies themselves that were being advanced, but rather the energy and organizing these figures helped to inspire. That is to say, not the policies, but the politics. In the end, the center vanquished the left in both cases, as we all know, upholding what had been a core thesis of Leo's since his great book with Colin Leys, The End of Parliamentary Socialism, which has now come out in a new version as Searching for Socialism. Though Leo had always said that he hoped the activist in Momentum would prove him and Colin wrong. So what I'm getting at here is a certain contradictory nature of Leo's engagement with social democratic parties, with social democratic politics, and with the Democratic Party in the US, which is the nearest equivalent in the United States to a social democratic party. His commitment to these projects, building from the left of these social democratic parties, as well as his sympathies for Tony Benn and the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy earlier on, were animated fundamentally by what Leo referred to as the optimism of the intellect, reversing the aphorism that is often wrongly attributed to Antonio Gramsci. Socialist intellectual leadership for Leo was about understanding the limits as well as the possibilities of the present conjuncture. Leo's socialism was one of sobriety and realism, which were two words of which he was very fond and said often. They were always on the tip of his tongue. Indeed, he would not entertain any fantasies about what Corbyn or Sanders would accomplish should they take office, which he emphasized was in itself going to require defying great odds, just getting to office, let alone doing anything once you're in office. On the other hand, this intellectual sobriety, this acute knowledge and awareness of the limits of what could be achieved within social democratic parties and capitalist states coexisted, however uncomfortably, with a profound revolutionary optimism. Optimism of the intellect, as he called it. Optimism of the intellect for Leo means thinking strategically and creatively, searching for openings from within our historical present to transform the world. So he believed that socialist intellectuals must be guided not by Gramsci's pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will, but by a profound intellectual optimism, a creative search for possibilities and openings within the present that can open the way for it to be transformed, for the world to be transformed, and for the left to rebuild. So what does it mean then to apply these contradictory principles of sobriety and optimism in a moment where those opportunities and openings are so small as they are today? When openings for transformative change, as they do now, seem more remote than ever. Could these efforts, Corbyn, Sanders, as Benn before, contain the germ of something new? Whether optimistic or pessimistic, there is perhaps here a basic contradiction between will and intellect. To maintain sobriety and seriousness in one's analysis, yet also to remain committed to living as if socialism is possible, even though this possibility seems more distant than it's ever been. Was Leo's commitment to these projects then perhaps a matter of trying to overcome his own intellectual pessimism? Not representing a capitulation to social democracy, as some have claimed, but rather a mark of his struggle to maintain the revolutionary optimism of which he spoke. Leo and I lived relatively close to each other, and in his last summer, we had weekly lunches that would stretch on for hours. At the last one, not long before he was hospitalized, he lamented the failures of the New Left. Though its revision of Marxist theory to overcome tired dogmas and rigid scholasticism had been positive, he regretted that the New Left generation of which he was a part had not resulted in the new politics to accompany these theoretical openings that could escape this dual trap of Leninism and social democracy. Indeed, all of the new parties that emerged in Europe had become social democratized in a way that reflected their inability to transcend, at least so far, the impasses of social democratic politics. To me, it is above all a sign of Leo's commitment to this search, to creatively struggling to find an opening at a time when there is so little reason to hope, that explains these engagements with social democracy. He both recognized the likely limits to these projects and remained committed to the development of those in and around them as they searched for a socialist organizational form adequate to representing the working classes and waging a democratic struggle on the terrain of these states today. If there is a hope for humanity, it surely lies in the efforts of this new generation of socialist activists, struggling amidst the most difficult conditions. And we must all face the struggle, as Leo did, with honesty and integrity, to maintain our own optimism of the intellect in these very dark times, a struggle which in many ways has been made harder by the loss of one of the beacons of international socialism.
Well, thank you, Steve. And now let's turn the spotlight over to Greg Albo for his remarks.
Thanks for the introduction, Cliff, and thanks to the Center for hosting us and hosting the memorial today, allowing us to speak. It's been a long, disturbing number of months. It's been very hard to get used to. It just still is kind of stunning with Leo's passing. At the end of the summer, we had been meeting here and there, somewhat like Steve, and kind of making plans for the next 10 years of thinking of kind of projects we want to do with the Socialist Register, but also kind of various kinds of projects and things we might think we could accomplish in the city politically and so forth. And then in the early fall, we'd actually begun kind of mapping out some things for the next 2 years, some of our, again, political work, but also in relationship to the register. It's very hard to comprehend that those collaborations right now are over. Um, I've had a long, uh, incredible experience with working with Leo over the years, political work together, friendship, shared teaching, and so on. I actually began to learn about Leo and hear about him. It was actually a group of students who were 15 years ahead of me at the University of Manitoba that were mostly of Jewish background, but also similarly from working class parts of Winnipeg. And a legendary class and group of them who all kind of went on to major roles in the trade union movement or in academia. And I heard them partly through a couple of common professors, most notably Cy Gonick. And we already kind of in the late 70s, early 80s, we had also had a kind of a range of shared friends and political friends in particular related to the some of the struggles going on in Canada in relationship to the peace movement, in relationship to wage and price controls and so on. So we kind of already kind of been meeting and hearing about Leo as I was studying and kind of involved with these political things, but never had met him yet. When I moved to Ottawa and went to Carleton, things changed in an incredibly quick fashion. I think within about a week or so, in a month of meeting him, I kind of took up his class in comparative politics, where I've been switched from economics to do political science. I wasn't as confined in what I could roam around thinking about as you are in economics. I was his teaching assistant. He employed me a little bit later as also a research assistant on a book he was working on Canadian unions and some of the legal restrictions. And I actually, within a week of being in Ottawa, I kind of had joined the political group he was associated with, the Ottawa Committee for Labor Action, with a few other friends. So I was immediately into this network of political projects, intellectual work, and soon editing friends and so on. When I moved to York in the 1990s, early 1990s, joining Leo there, very soon our friendship and collaborations immediately extended a lot into teaching and more formally research projects that we had on the go, and we're kind of running through York and seminars at York on a regular basis, and particularly sharing a lot of graduate students when I moved into the graduate faculty a few years later, and eventually also kind of joined him on the editing the Socialist Register, and had collaborated over 10 volumes now on in the Register since the early 2000, since about 2011, I guess. And moving to Toronto was also a kind of an added dimension. Of course, I had known Sam Gindin by then, both by reputation and meeting him casually at some of the union meetings that would occur in Ottawa. He was still at the CAW then, but this began, an additional round of working with Leo and Sam on different kind of political collaborations, struggles going on in the CAW, educational activist networks. We always seem to be starting and trying to keep going and sustaining, and writing any kind of number of political tracks, sometimes incognito, sometimes more formally, particularly focused on kind of struggles going on in Canada. I think for me it's been an incredible journey of with Leo and a range of other friends like Sam, Steve, Rosemary, who's here, a bunch of others. An incredible journey of friendship, debate, struggles. And I think as Steve focused, what kind of animated us through this entire period was, a struggle to find a new socialist politics in theory. Obviously, given our place in Canada, it was particularly related to those struggles in Canada, but our bounds of interest, in particular, Leo's in particular, his engagements were never confined to Canada, nor were our politics. And it was, the difficult part, I think, of this time period and finding that it was, those New Left projects had kind of largely evaporated by the 1990s. And, everything was kind of also had kind of disintegrated in and around it. And you were stuck trying to find a space both to defeat neoliberalism and neoliberal globalization in particular, and finding a way to kind of gain traction in an alternative movement, an alternative focus. And, it led us in kind of different kinds of projects, from kind of being very engaged with aspects of coalitional politics in the cities in Canada, trying to find traction among different groups, trying to forge different alliances with different groups, and trying to find hope in various movements that are arise, such as Syriza, or the left bloc in Portugal now, or Zapatistas, or trying to find what was positive and where working class and the politics of the oppressed were beginning to break through and might eventually lead to new political formations. It's, in one sense, it's been like an incredible, invigorating kind of experience being engaged with these struggles with Leo as a constant collaborator and companion. I think I kind of share Leo's optimism of the intellect, but I'm also a bit always more wary of where we were going and where we're at, and always kind of held a little bit more on the, how would you say, the wishing we could do a lot better, and the sense of frustration. So I think it's going to be hard right now. It's a good thing that Sam shares a lot of that optimism of the intellect of Leo, and I can share that. And you heard Steve just talk, and he's trying to find his bearing and keeping that optimism of the intellect, because I'm going to need them a lot without Leo's presence and his kind of ways to. Well, I'll say it actually. What I often was calibrating as an over optimism in this part, a necessary over optimism too. But what I was always calibrating as a bit of an over optimism on some of these things. But without that, it's going to be terrible to miss, and the debates are not going to have that we have amongst us. And the four of us, Leo, Steve, Sam, and I, would often be engaged with a few others here and there, are not going to quite have the same fury and insights and so on without Leo's presence. And certainly I need that spirit of optimism at times these days, as I tend to the opposite direction in a certain way by temperament. I think Leo's career in research and writing is marked by a number of phases that I kind of, maybe it's coming about 10, 15 years after him in research and in age in research. And you're kind of following the same terrain and looking at them with a slightly different lens, but inevitably they were kind of overlapped in both theoretical and intellectual and political interest with his. The first phase I would think was out of his dissertation research and coming through the post-war period into the 1970s with his first book on social democracy and industrial militancy, which he more or less wrapped up in the mid 1970s, which was focused on the contradictions inside social democracy in the Keynesian era, particularly in terms of what Leo had identified as the central contradiction for social democracy as it was being refracted through the state, the need to contain for the Social Democrats in power, and given their general philosophy, to contain some of the class struggles that were merging out of wage struggles and pushing in the direction of workers' controls and other kinds of struggles at the workplace, and incomes policy being both an attempt to stabilize capitalist economy and becoming also a force of discipline of the working class in around those issues. And this as being a central contradiction that was leading to a new left inside social democracy and outside social democracy that was attempting to push and break past the bounds that had been set up by post-war social democracy. In Canada, it wasn't kind of refracted in quite the same way because of the strength of social democracy was much more mutated. But similar issues occurred in Canada over what were wage and price controls in the mid 1970s, and over what was called the 6 and 5 program in the early 1980s, attempting to kind of control working class militancy. And Leo's writing on this was critical. The work of Rosemary, and who's here, and other people, was an aspect of these struggles. And it was whether we could push beyond where social democracy is and find an alternative political vehicle, an alternative politics that could push us beyond that. And it didn't occur. And out of that came, I think, the second phase of Leo's work, from the more or less from the mid 1970s, a bit later into the early 1990s, a decade or so of research focused particularly on the crisis of capitalism and the way that this crisis of capitalism, both an accumulation and legitimation crisis, as Leo put it in his introduction to an edited book on the Canadian state that became very well known in Canada, put it. This was also being reflected in a new coerciveness inside the state, which is a book that I kind of initially helped research Leo with, From Consent to Coercion, on the assault on trade unions, which was dealing with the turn to coercion in the Canadian state, but it was something that was occurring elsewhere, and using shifts in labor legislation, often exceptional legislation, to discipline the working classes as part of the break that was occurring either from social democracy themselves or from the establishment parties, and attempting to discipline workers and widen the space for neoliberalism. Much of Leo's writing in that time period, the essay that Steve mentioned on the impasse of social democracy, but also his other writings on incomes policies, the decline of workers' control, a range of issues dealing with the contradictions of corporatism, were all exploring that breakup and the space it was allowing for the counter-revolution of neoliberalism. And particularly, Leo was insistent on that. And it's important to see this in terms of his work later on globalization of the state. It was important he was pointing out this counter-revolution was not occurring apart from the state, but was occurring through the state, and reorganizing state apparatuses and the relationship of the working classes in the relationship to the state. I think the other thing that Leo had an early kind of insight on, that this was not a point of American decline, but when one looked back and looked a little bit deeper at what was occurring, it was the U.S. under Reagan, but particularly also U.S. State institutions that were often leading this process of transformation towards neoliberalism. And therefore, he was kind of at the forefront in the 1990s in insisting that it was completely wrong to look at neoliberalism as markets against states, as states were completely involved in both the disorganization of the working classes, but also building new barricades or new reinforcement for this new politics. And fundamentally, what it was doing was not only in capitalist workplace, but through the state, was in an engaged process of systematically shifting the balance of power away from the working classes. I think this more or less led by the 1990s with all the development of the free trade agreements, the European community mutating into the European Union, and so on, led to the focus on an essay in the early mid 1990s on globalization in the state, which began mapping out a new trajectory. We'd actually worked on this on a project together with Gimden and others, taking some of this material up. I think I can't quite remember if we did it at Port Elgin, the education retreat of the auto workers, or it was at York. But we had ran a number of seminars trying to think through this stuff, and Sam was working on it in terms of a perspective on the auto workers against competitiveness and against particularly progressive competitiveness the workers being engaged with this kind of new post-Fordist project. And I was working on this in my dissertation, but also in a critique of the shift in social democracy towards training policies and so forth on building a new competitiveness inside the union movements and the firms in this new period. I think there's a number of themes in this period that led to his great book with Sam on the making of global capitalism. One of them was just as I was speaking about the shifting role of the balance of forces that occurred through the 1980s that was allowing for a different phase in American leadership. But it was also about the role of the U.S. that was expanding from the way that it had set up the U.S. position in Bretton Woods and through the rule of law through GATT and the IMF and so on. It was kind of picking up something that came from Harry Magdoff on Magdoff's writing in Monthly Review on the American informal empire, or as Magdoff was calling it, empire without colonies, and Leo and Sam had renamed it an informal empire, the way that this was actually expanding on the logic that was already contained in the Bretton Woods system and attempting to build globalization and extend it in a kind of new kind of grand project out of the US. And the way that this was now a kind of global process of Americanization, the way that Poulantzas in political power and social classes, or sorry, in classes in contemporary capitalism, had identified this as part of what was occurring inside the European community and in Europe, that this wasn't a process of Europe being against the US, but it was a way that that there was a process of Americanization inside the power blocks of Europe, which meant a quite different constellation of the way that national capitals were relating to each other. This gave Leo a foundation and Sam a foundation for predicting something quite different than was common on the left in the globalization debates of the 1990s. The globalization of the debates 1990s, almost from the left of social democracy through the Trotskyist movement to the communist parties, was all about a resurgence of inter-imperialist rivalry as a result of this new internationalization, going back to Lenin's and Bukharin's claims about what would occur from the internationalization of capital and new contradictions form. I don't think, I think it's always been wrong, the interpretation that took this as, relatively cheap and easy, in my view, an unthinking response that said this was simply Kautsky redux, an ultra imperialism. It had nothing to do with that, and was much more about the conditions that had changed in the internationalization of capital, that the form was very distinct from what it was in the late 19th century, but also over and above that, the nature of states, each state, but the way that supranational state structures had formed under American leadership were also mutating any kind of return to an inter-imperialist rivalry of the late 19th century. This is very different from the way that Kautsky had posed it, and was a thinking about the changes in states and state functions that was very distinct from what had been Kautsky had been thinking. And I think probably one of the theses that has held up the most, even as we've gone into this period of late neoliberalism and some of the fracturing that's been occurring in and around that. The other thing I think that was important in that book was Leo and Sam's writing about the difference of world money and the way that world money was so contingent on the leading state institutions and the leading state for maintaining stability in the international finance system as we move from the US dollar gold exchange standard system through the fiat money system into essentially a credit money system, and the way that a key state had to play a role in stabilizing world money now in a way that states had always played in relationship to their own currencies through the history of capitalism. This meant a quite different analysis of the way that the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve were positioned, and the relationship they had to play not only to American capital, but now also in terms of what Leo and Sam called superintending global capitalism. That is, they had to play a coordinative role between the central banks of the world to stabilize the world monetary system. Obviously, they pose this not as, again, some sort of functionalist or superhuman capacity that had become embedded in the Fed to manage the global economy, but out of the necessity of responding to crises. And out of the necessity of responding to crises, the U.S. was the only state that had the capacity to coordinate other ones and fumble its way through the crisis and kind of deal with the particularities of the current financialization side of neoliberal globalization. I think alongside this third phase was in the last decade or so since writing The Making of Global Capitalism, there was something of a fourth phase in Leo's research, coinciding with the study of globalization, but now particularly more if he was concerned with the making of global capitalism. This was him and Sam together were particularly, I would almost say, obsessed in a good way, and it was the best part of his optimism of the conditions which might make for a remaking of a working class agency, organization, and political strategies. That was the importance of the various books and essays he was writing almost for the last decade were about that theme. What were the conditions for, what might be the conditions for making parties of a new kind? What would we have? What struggles did we have to put into the trade union movement to remake what they were, from the way that almost universally the trade union movement in the North has become very ossified. What strategies could do to organize workers in the new sectors of work and so on. I think if I can end here, I identify almost personally, almost completely with most of those themes in Leo's writing. If as anybody would, you come at them from different angles. I think this, for me, it was also a shared aspect of what we shared as colleagues and academics and university teachers. And that was a shared commitment to building institutions for working class students, for critical students in the university, and building spaces for them to engage in deepening socialist theoretical and intellectual work in spaces where those of us of working class backgrounds have been traditionally not part of. And this, I think, for both of us was a theme kind of picking up from Marx, but which Gramsci had also formulated in terms of building a critical political science that was engaged with the process of radical transformation, as well as deepening what we could learn and do as political scientists, as political economists, in understanding the world as it existed, and to begin or to build a process, as Marx put it, in converting the state from an organ standing above society into one completely subordinated to it. In other words, the pushing of a project of democratization within the institutions and formations formed by working class people of all backgrounds, of all genders, of all positions of struggle, and also not being able to think about this without a project from converting the state from an institution above us and against us typically to one that would enable us all to build our capacities. Thank you. Rest in peace, Leo. Thank you, Cliff, and others for hosting us today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Greg, and also Steve. I want to, we're going to be moving on, but we'll come back to you and have an opportunity to talk with you further. But I want to take a moment just to acknowledge the fact that among those here in this webinar is Melanie Panitch. She's here with many friends, and I'm trying to, you see her there someplace? Okay, I was trying to spotlight her, but I can't seem to get that to work.
I can say hello. Thank you, Cliff.
There you
Maybe
are.
that puts a yellow light around my square.
Okay, yes. Yeah, there are many friends and colleagues of Leo here, and I know they'd want to see you and say hello to you.
Thank you.
But we're going to move on now, having heard from Steve and Greg, and I want to we want to hear from Leo. This past summer, July 6th, Leo did a webinar for the Center for Global Justice, and we'd like to play that. The topic was socialism, capitalism, and the pandemic. It's about a 40-minute talk that he gave, and following that, then there'll be an opportunity for some discussion among us. So Roberto, who is our technical person, if you would start, you can play that video of his talk in last July. We don't have the sound. Roberto?
Roberto, you need to unmute.
In the winter months and telling me what a remarkable collection of lefties, intellectual and cultural, were to be found there. My wife and I went there for the first time in February. And who did I discover? I discovered you, who I had met through the Radical Philosophy Association in a trip that you sponsored for a bunch of us to go to Cuba. Liz Maestros, my dear friend from the Breath Forum and Marxist Institute in New York, Gregory Dimon, and a whole host of others. And I realized that you are a continuation of the romance that the North American left, especially the American left, has had with the Mexican Revolution since the beginning, since the early part of the 20th century. Of course, that was most solidified in art, with the links that were created between the muralists of the type that I have to say, the walls where I attended that lecture back in February were covered in the most remarkable political murals. And I was in New York in early March, just before everything was shut down, and attended at MoMA a remarkable exhibit on the link between the muralists and the American left in the 1920s and 1930s. Fascinating. So that's a long way of an introduction of saying I never would have imagined that I'd be giving a talk to the Center for Global Justice so soon, unless I came back to San Miguel. And now the pandemic has created a situation in which I can do this through this medium in cyberspace. Of course, when I went there in February, one was aware that there was a very dangerous virus that had global dimension. But I think the left needs to own this. It wasn't only capitalist states that were blithely ignoring what did happen by March. It was also well-educated people like ourselves. I remember going to and coming back on the airplane from Toronto to Mexico City, and no one was thinking about the pandemic, even though by that point, there were already a number of cases in North America. So there we have it. The pandemic was on the march in February, and not only were capitalist governments ignoring it, we on the left, I think, were thinking ourselves invincible in the face. The title I chose for this talk, Capitalism, Socialism, and the Pandemic, was deliberately chosen so that it would apply as much to the pandemic of 1918, 1919, the Spanish flu pandemic at the end of World War I, as it could apply to today. A speech could have been given, I'm sure speeches were given, called Capitalism, Socialism, and the Pandemic in 1918, 1919. It was known as the Spanish flu, and somewhat similar today, that was a misnomer, just as Trump was trying to name the current coronavirus the Chinese virus. In fact, that virus was begun in Kansas in the United States on a pig farm, and it was American soldiers sent to World War I and turning the tide in terms of the outcome of World War I, who carried it to Europe. And then after the war, they brought it back. And that was crucial to the second wave. What's, I think, important about, and why I wanted the title of the talk to reflect both pandemics, was that we are hearing today, as one heard then from the left, the phrase commonly intoned, socialism or barbarism. This was a phrase that Rosa Luxemburg, in her Junius pamphlet in 1916 during World War I, had made very famous, although it was by no means new. As she said in discussing it, a generation earlier, Engels had used the phrase, saying, capitalist society stands at a crossroads, either a transition to socialism or a regression to barbarism. She cited Engels, but in fact it was Kautsky who in 1892 actually said that. Engels probably repeated it in a speech, a very chilling speech he made in 1896, predicting, very astonishingly, the slaughter of inter-imperial wars that were likely to come in the early 20th century. But the phrase became associated with Luxemburg. And it became associated, of course, with barbarism in the form it took, with the inter-imperial conflicts. After the globalization and the dynamism of capitalism in, the early 20th century, the great second industrial revolution, that war brought people to the attention that if you weren't able to achieve, to get out of capitalism, there would be a regression to that. And one's hearing that again today, in the context of this pandemic, in the context of the inability of capitalist states to prepare for it, to contain it properly, by virtue of the way in which so much of the public healthcare industry in contemporary capitalism has been demeaned through austerity, and the way even in those countries which do have universal Medicare, increasingly have it in a way that is bound up with private capital accumulation and the firms that provide healthcare, even to the public sector. So the parallels in that respect are important, I think, to bear in mind, especially at a moment when you could say for the first time since the 1910s, the word socialism has some good odor in the American public discourse. And then there's some other uncanny parallels. That conjuncture was marked by the assertion of American isolationism in the wake of World War I. We all know that Woodrow Wilson's attempt to get the United States to sign on to the League of Nations was defeated in the American Senate. And mixed up with that isolationism, which if you go back and read some of the speeches sound a lot like Trump, was an anti-immigration sentiment, which led by 1924 to the closure of American borders, to the great migration that had taken place to the United States, not least from Europe, from the 1870s, one could even say, when it came to Germans and the Irish, from the 1840s and 1850s onwards. So there are parallels that are very interesting. And then there's another parallel. That great second industrial revolution, which produced, of course, great breakthroughs in medicine, in drugs, as well as the impact that public sanitation services, which were finally introduced in urban areas by the beginning of the 20th century, were having, was not able to prevent the Great Flu at the end of World War I. People had to face soberly and coldly the fact that capitalist development, dynamic capitalist development, did not mean that the way in which nature always bit back humankind for the way it came to dominate nature, which was through plagues very often, that this could happen in capitalist industrialized societies, and even with an industrialized medical system. And we're seeing that today in the wake of the fourth great industrial revolution, the technological revolution, the information digital revolution as well. So there are parallels in that respect that are worth, I think, thinking about. The isolationism in that conjunction, which came from a United States which was just asserting its primacy in 20th century capitalism, was just beginning to prove in the first decades of the 20th century that the 20th century belonged to the United States. It was the Americans. The isolationism was reflected in the United States not joining the League of Nations, in the closure to migration, but it was negated by the dynamism of American capitalism through the 1920s. The carve up of the old empires, the old European empires, was crucial to the American placement in the Middle East, along with the British, in terms of the extraction of oil for the fossil fuel industry, which was so important to industrialization. The United States was crucially involved in that moment in the carve-up of the modern day Middle East. Secondly, the multinational corporations jumped over that isolationist policy. General Motors and Ford were setting up car assembly plants, not only in Canada, but in Europe through the 1920s. What was not so much the case as the way in which Trump's isolationism is countered and negated today was the limited capacity of the American state to take any responsibility for managing an international capitalism. The Fed had only been created in 1912. The American dollar was already beginning to replace the pound sterling as the global currency. And indeed, the reparations put upon the Germans for losing the war, which involved paying reparations to France and the United Kingdom, was really a matter of paying the London and Paris, and having them, by virtue of their debts to the United States, having borrowed so heavily to prosecute the war in dollars, shoveling that money back to New York. And one of the reasons that the 1920s produced the type of instability was that the Americans played a role in the 1920s, which helped to bring the world back to the gold standard, didn't manage the financialization that led to, and when the Great Depression came out of that financial instability, the Federal Reserve didn't have a clue how to contain it. In today's conjuncture, it is the Federal Reserve alone amongst the American state apparatuses which has proved its competence in the current pandemic and the economic crisis that it has produced. The Fed has acted as the world central bank. Not only is the American central bank in underwriting the American stock market, buying municipal debt for the first time in its history, buying junk bonds so the bond market wouldn't collapse, but much lending indeed to small businesses, financing the American state's asset purchases of the largest trucking company in the United States. Practically, as even no one has ever noticed this, in the same way the Treasury did that during the 2008-9 crisis when they bought a portion of General Motors. But what the Fed above all has done, which it did not at all do in the early part of the century after the conjuncture of the previous pandemic, was act as the world central bank, pouring dollars around the world through swaps to other central banks so that their financial markets would not be bereft of dollars, which is the global currency, and their financial systems would seize up. They expanded the swap lines that were used in 2008, 2007, 2008, to 9 other countries, including Mexico. And by virtue of that, have put some $5 trillion into the global economic system that has kept the financial system going, the capitalist financial system going. It's been extremely active, and unlike 2007-8, when it was hiding what it was doing in this respect, thinking that not only Republicans, but even Democrats would attack the Fed for lending dollars abroad in the middle of the crisis, the Fed has been very open about doing this. So there's a major contrast between what the American state was at the time of the pandemic, in that conjunction after World War I, 100 years ago, and what it is. I want to come back to what the American state is today and how demeaned it is apart from its capacity to be a firefighter in the face of financial crises. But first, I want to draw another parallel, and that is to bring up the question of socialism, the other side of socialism. Of course, the Russian Revolution shares a date with the flu epidemic, 1918. But even apart from the promise of the Russian Revolution, the hopes that it generated, etc., one needs to remember the flowering of socialist movements and discourse and media in the United States in the decade of 1910. Debs running for president in 1912, the Appeal to Reason being the largest socialist newspaper in the United States with 500,000 subscribers, socialist mayors being elected in tiny little cowboy towns across the American West. And it wasn't only a matter in that moment, in that conjuncture of the Russian Revolution. The utterly parliamentarist British Labour Party, which had not been admitted to the Second International because it had never accepted the thesis of class struggle being at the core of transformative social change. It had always been premised on we will bring the ruling class and the working class together in harmony. In 1918, even the British Labour Party adopted its famous Clause 4, committing itself to the common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange, and their democratic administration. So that pandemic was a moment in which to say socialism or barbarism provided, it seemed, a real alternative to capitalism. And we see today, despite the fact that we now can look back and see that not without the role of the American state, the promise of the American Revolution, the promise of the Mexican Revolution was undermined. We can see that despite commitments on the part of social democracy to socialist goals and values, those parties became increasingly integrated within the framework of a global capitalism through the course of the 20th century. We see that despite all of that, despite the collapse of communism after its denouement in a stagnating Stalinism by the 1960s and 70s and 80s, despite the loss of any commitment to socialism on the part of social democratic parties, all of whom who embraced Clinton's third way and took the American Democratic Party under Clinton's neoliberalism as their model, we see a revival of socialist promise and socialist discourse, of all places, in the heart of the empire over the course of the last years. And I'm not just speaking of Sanders' candidacy. I'm not only speaking of Our Revolution, which is of course his campaign organization. Although I don't think one should denigrate the way in which Sanders uses revolution. Identifying a ruling class, identifying how it undermines democracy, insisting on the universalization of social programs, and above all, describing himself as the organizer in chief, should he be president, the image of the socialist cadre as the organizer. One shouldn't denigrate that use of revolution, it seems to me. However modest, if you like, Sanders' proposals in fact are in revolutionary terms. But beyond that, one sees a flowering of socialist media in, of all places, the heart of the empire, with Jacobin having 50,000 subscribers and 2 million hits to its website a month. Now, whatever one wants to make of opinion polls that show a majority of Americans under 35 more positively disposed to socialism and capitalism. Simply wants to say to them, what do you mean by socialism? Nevertheless, this does seem to me to give a concreteness, a possibility to the phrase socialism and barbarism. A century after Rosa Luxemburg resurrected the term from the 1890s, that it hasn't had for a very, very long time. Now, one has to say that socialism did not replace capitalism, not only because of repression, not only because of the encirclement of the Russian Revolution, the extent to which that was a key factor in introducing the dictatorship in the Soviet Union, not only in the repression of socialist movements, not least in the United States, through the course of the 20th century. It also had to do with the dynamism of capitalism, especially after the Great Depression, some of which could be already seen in the 1920s, interrupted by the second great crisis of capitalism, and then brought back to life through the stimulus of the war economy as well as the New Deal, and through the post-war period, a massification of capitalist commodification and finance and credit, as well as a expansion of capitalist production, both in capacities, both in goods and services, which did have the effect of integrating working classes in the advanced capitalist world into the capitalist economy in a way that would have been unimaginable to even the most sober Marxist critics at the time of the 1918, 1919 pandemic. You could still argue then that Marx's prediction that with capitalist development would come proletarian immiseration was being proved visibly. Through the course of the 20th century, you could only hold on to that notion by saying that immiseration was relative in the advanced capitalist countries, because there was no question that the mass of the working class, that its standard of living was indeed increased. In good part, of course, through its own efforts in organizing the labor movement, through its political pressures within liberal democracy, but accessing thereby the enormous riches of capitalist commodities, sometimes through the welfare payments they received, more often through the collective bargaining gains, which in the American case, moreover, in the post-war period, when the rest of the advanced capitalist world opted for socialized universal Medicare, which was seeded, by the way, in the realization of the public health consequences of the pandemic of 1919. In the American case, the labor movement was able to obviate the winning of that by securing medical insurance through collective bargaining, privatizing, if you like, healthcare through its collective bargaining stream. The result of that being that the United States has been left without a public Medicare system, the irrationality of which is exposed more than ever in the face of this pandemic. But the limits of a labor movement, which recruits members by promising them health insurance, private health insurance, was seen in the fact that labor unions were not supporting Sanders in his demand for universal Medicare, because it would reduce their capacity to hold on to members, or to get new ones. So I think one does have to recognize that the fact that socialism versus barbarism did not see much of an option for much of the century after the 1919 pandemic, did have to do with the dynamism and integrative capacity of advanced capitalism. And insofar as that wasn't the case in what used to be known as the third world, the developing world, it nevertheless was the case that for the most part, what they aspired to was getting out of the underdevelopment that prevented industrialization in their countries and getting on the capitalist commodification treadmill that was denied them by the reproduction of imperialism, colonialism, even with decolonization after World War. Okay, that's the parallel I wanted to make, and I hope people find it somewhat interesting. But where does it really leave us in terms of the prospects for socialism today? I am not at all depressed about this by virtue of Sanders' defeat. I don't think that the energy in any sense has been diminished by that in any substantive way. And I think indeed you see the continuing energy of it in the extent to which the Black Lives Matter protest is remarkable. This wave of protests that have taken place during the course of this pandemic in the face of police brutalization of the Black population. The fact that these protests are so heavily integrated racially is, I think, unlike the protests of the 1960s, except in the early 60s around the Civil Rights Act, like the massive protests, riots from 1964 on in almost all cities in the United States were not integrated. These are, and I think it has much to do with the shift to the left that has taken place, embracing a conception of socialism once again in the United States. Moreover, for all of the talk of American decline, for all of the American talk of the United States no longer being at the center of the capitalist universe, it is nevertheless fascinating that that outbreak of political protest in the United States over what has always been the Achilles heel of American democracy, that is racism and the caste system that balkanizes the American working class. America remains enough in the public eye that it kicks off demonstrations right around the world of this kind of political nature. I think it was already the case with the anti-globalization movements, if you want to start with Seattle in 1999, that the irrationality of a global capitalism was becoming more and more visible to more and more young people. At that time, the disappointments with social democratic parties, with the communist parties, gave a strong anarchist tinge to those protests, a strong anti-party tinge, a admiration for the Zapatistas in Mexico, articulated in terms of changing the world without taking power. But it was discovered through the course of those protests, coming to a climax with Occupy in 2011, that you can protest forever, and protest till hell freezes over and you won't change the world. And there was a remarkable turn in the wake of that, back to politics, of which the Sanders phenomenon was one element. Podemos, Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, the Corbyn phenomenon in Britain, were other exemplars of it. And the fact that you've had a mobilizing political campaign explicitly defining itself as democratic socialism, which has centered on the irrationality of capitalist states in terms of growing inequality and growing lack of access to public health, seems to me to bode extremely well for the continuing viability of this socialist discourse and this socialist energy that we've seen, despite the defeats of Corbyn and Syriza and Sanders. What reinforces this is that the economic crisis of 2008, followed by the politics of austerity, which was installed everywhere after the stimulus that capitalist states engaged in, both monetary and fiscal, in order to prevent it turning into another Great Depression. The bringing financial markets back to their health reinforced their power to discipline states to not spend money on social expenditure so that they could pay off their debts to the financial system. What has happened by virtue of that development is that the economic crisis morphed into a political crisis. And that is what Trump represents. He represents not a continuation of the economic crisis so much, but a turning of that economic crisis into a political crisis, in which the illegitimacy of capitalist globalization in people's eyes on the left and as well as on the right has been a central factor. Unlike those who championed globalization in the 1980s and 90s and said it was the matter of states no longer being able to control capital and therefore needing to get on board with transnational capital flows. In fact, states were never bypassed by capital. They made globalization. You don't get free trade agreements by multinational corporations signing them. States sign free trade agreements. It was the free trade agreement that was signed between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, NAFTA, that epitomized the free trade agreements that codified globalization around the world, opened up trade markets and capital flows to the extent that they did. So states remained very active in a globalized capitalism. They were authors of it, but they legitimated it to their populations in terms of it being in the national interest. And that was especially done in the United States. NAFTA was presented by Clinton, despite having indicated he wasn't keen on it during his election campaign, as in the American national interest. And what Trump picked up by 2016, and so did Sanders, was the continuous failure of the Democratic Party to be able to demonstrate to so many American workers, as was also obvious to so many Mexican workers, that this was hardly in the national interest, insofar as one looked to what that did for the working classes in those countries. So globalization, by virtue of this contradiction between the legitimation of a political system still being based on nation-state identifications and a economic system that is increasingly oriented transnationally, that contradiction produces the kind of political crisis that Trump represents. In his case, of course, it is combined with a right-wing populism that has barbaric connotations to it, inbuilt. Whereas in the case of the socialist critics of globalization, who also point to its lack of legitimacy in terms of democracy at a national level, are offering the alternative to those barbaric economies. What I've always been most concerned about, and I'll come to an end with this, since Trump's election, would be that there would be a punch-up between a Black Lives Matter demonstration and a local police force, with perhaps a police station being burnt by virtue of the police use of arms against demonstrators. And that insofar as local police forces and bicycle gangs form the base of Trump's political movement, that this would become the opportunity for a closure of democratic political space in the United States. I feared, after what happened in Minneapolis, after the demonstrations and riots that it produced, and after Trump was calling for the military to intervene, that we were seeing that script being written out. And that barbarism was going to be visited upon us in this pandemic situation via a Trump equivalency of the Napoleon Bonaparte dictatorship that Marx wrote about in the 18th Brumaire, which also, by the way, took place after a failed impeachment. I still fear that Trump will attempt to postpone the election, which would probably have to go to the Supreme Court. And of course, he'll do so in the most brazen way, given that he's made light of the pandemic, insofar as it is continuing in the fall, in the most brazen way, as he always does. He will say, well, we can't possibly have an election in these circumstances, and try to get the Supreme Court, since it's unclear who constitutionally is responsible for American elections, Congress, is the state level, etc. And if the Supreme Court were to endorse that postponement, I think it would make the riots that have taken place in recent weeks look like a tea party, and I don't mean the Boston Tea Party. Were he to run in the election and lose and refuse to resign on the grounds that postal balloting is necessarily fraudulent, that would produce an even greater wave of riots. And the question at that point would be whether Trump would be able to call in martial law and the army would accede to keeping him in power. I think we've had a foretaste of that, and the response of the generals, including of all people, Mad Dog Mattis, who was his defense secretary, and his chief of staff, Kelly, as well as a number of generals, saying they weren't going to be pulled into this, shows that there's still some life left in American democracies, even on the side of the forces of repression, the apparatuses of repression in the United States. Were Biden to win, he obviously doesn't represent the socialist wing of socialism or barbarism. What he would represent, it seems to me, is an attempt to rebuild some of the capacity of the American state that was already whittled away very heavily in the neoliberal era under Clinton and Obama, as well as the Bushes, but under Trump has been carried to an extreme. It's ironic that the one state agency that has shown its capacity in this pandemic is the Federal Reserve, which has the greatest autonomy from the American state apparatus. Independent central banks which the left used to attack so much because they couldn't be given orders by democratically elected governments to run monetary policy the way they want. Well, the saving grace has been, and of course, mostly for the financiers, but also for the masses who are dependent on capitalist credit in order to be able to feed themselves and put a roof over their heads. We have been dependent on what the Federal Reserve has done to keep this bloody system going. And it showed remarkable capacity to do that, planning capacity to be ready for it. In the case of the health system, what you see is the astonishing lack of capacity in the American state. Of course, we know Trump has run down the capacity of the Treasury and the State Department, etc. But to see in report after report, in the context of the news about the pandemic, the way in which the Center for Disease Control was defunded, the way in which one agency for another dealing with pandemics under the auspices of National Security Council, not let alone the Department of Health and Human Resources, have been confused and diminished under this presidency, only doubles the effect of neoliberalism, whereby so much of public health care, so much of pandemic preparation was set out to contracts to private firms. Whether that was masks, this was done under the Clinton, but especially under the Obama administration as well. Whether it was masks or ventilators. Clinton had in fact put in a major order for ventilators to be met in the United States in 2011-12 from a Japanese firm and owned firm in California at $3,000 a ventilator. But that contract was never realized because that firm was taken over by a large medical instruments company. And they didn't want that firm competing with the ventilators they were producing at 20 times the price. So they broke the contract, didn't fulfill it. You see the irrationality of capitalism and the irrationality of the capitalist state in that one instance. But carried under the Trump administration to a level which is dumbfounding. The question will then be whether, given the pressure of this socialist enervation, which we've seen, especially in the heart of the empire in recent years, a Biden victory, while in no sense socialist, would be open to a rebuilding of state capacity to introduce reforms which would give confidence again, not only to socialists, but to working class people, which would include the type of reforms to labor legislation, which would provide the basis for a class remobilization, in fact, a new class formation in the United States, wherein the balkanization of the class in racial terms would begin to be overcome, as they have not been overcome under the framework of the old collective bargaining and labor relations legislation. Were that to be the case, then what Rosa argued, which is that there is no real opposition between reform and revolution. Reform is the means, revolution is the end, would come onto the agenda. And we have some hope after this pandemic is over for beginning to deal with the environmental crisis, which is, of course, what barbarism means today in terms of its challenge, much more than the threat of inter-internal war, that we might be able to begin to address them once again. I'll stop with that.
To participate in the discussion, we have Gregory Diamant with us, and Betsy Bowman, and myself. We'll probably all have questions that you want to ask. I'd like to pose a question somewhat related to this question of production being shut down. Relating, the question basically comes off your book, Making a Global Capitalism.
since writing it, there's been a couple of major transformations. For one, as you've referred to, the Trump administration has sought to weaken the state apparatus as well as the multilateral institutions that support globalism, WTO, NATO, as well as existing trade agreements. But second, the pandemic has disrupted the global supply chains that tie economies together. Might you now have to add another chapter to your book, titled maybe The Unmaking of Global Capitalism?
Yeah, well, that was always, of course, the implication of the book, although our message was that we would like the unmaking to be done by socialists rather than by a return to inter-imperial rivalry. And if you go back to the last chapter, we say a lot of that will depend on the Chinese movement.
Yeah.
Our argument was that the main contradictions in capitalism, in global capitalism, lie within states rather than between states. And while people have constantly on the left been constantly trying to resurrect Lenin's theory of imperialism by finding a return to inter-imperial rivalry, one empire replace another, or even leading to war, we were arguing that that was less likely than globalization being interrupted by domestic class struggles. And I think we've been borne out in that respect, especially in the United States, more than in China, although they certainly exist there. I mean, our question was, would the Chinese working class become integrated into consumerist, credit-driven capitalism the way the American working class, or at least large portions of it were, right? But it looks like we underestimated the extent to which divisions within the United States domestically, not always expressed by socialists by any means, would undermine America's leadership of globalization. And I think that is happening. That said, let's remember that Amazon, an American corporation, is keeping much of the world economy supply chains going. It's delivering goods and services, right? Not only inside the United States at a level that is unimaginable, but is doing so inside most countries in the world, and is growing phenomenally because of it. All the more cases, of course, were being made into a public utility. It's not the post office that should be shut down. Amazon should be taken over by the post office, and indeed organized. The workers in it unionized. We also see, this is very significant with regard to Wall Street and China's integration into global capitalism. On April 1st, the Chinese implemented a provision for which they've been under pressure all the way back to Clinton, but especially under Trump, which was to open up their financial services industry to total foreign ownership, especially asset management. And Morgan Stanley on that day bought out, which had a minority stake in a Chinese asset management firm. Soon, on the very day that China introduced that provision, that you could have full foreign ownership of an asset management firm, Morgan Stanley spent $1 billion buying out their Chinese partners so they could have full ownership. And China has generally responded to the pressure by opening up its financial services system to foreign capital, which is what's been Wall Street's agenda since the 1990s. So there is global, you're right, Cliff, I think the global supply chains have been badly hit. There's no question, and you see it in the amount of goods coming into Long Beach, like the port in Los Angeles. You see it in terms of ships floating around the world's ocean, carrying goods that they can't offload because people don't know what to do with those supplies, even though they've ordered them. No, this is a real crisis. And the irrationality, moreover, which was already clear in the context of the ecological crisis, of reliance on global supply in many essential, in the production of many essential products, has also been borne out, even in the production of masks, right? Let alone much for the vital equipment. Right? So ideologically as well, there's a visibility of the irrationality, all of which makes it quite precarious, I agree. Nevertheless, the integration of capitalism, capitalist firms, multinational corporations, is very real. Much more so than it was in the 1920s, when that already negated the isolationism of the Republic. Well, it's much, much deeper than it. So that isolationism has a lot of material forces to contest against. Although those material forces are full of contradictions of the kind you're pointing to. And we'll have to see where it goes.
Yeah, we're Roberto, let's end that. The discussion went on for better part of an hour. We've given you a little sample of what followed his talk, but we want to make sure that there's an opportunity for you all to participate in discussion now with our two guests, Greg Alpo and Steve Maurer. There are no doubt questions that some of you have or comments that you might want to make. There are many here who were friends of or colleagues of Leo, and maybe they want to share some of their thoughts also. Now, to do that, there's some people who are watching this on YouTube. And the way for those on YouTube to get their questions or comments in is to email them to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And I will be monitoring that. And if you send your question or comment to that address, then I will be able to pass it on to those in the Zoom room. But as far as those who are in the Zoom room, you can put your questions directly. And to do that, what you need to do is turn on your camera and wave at me. And if I'll put you on gallery view so I can see everybody here in the Zoom room. And if I see you waving, trying to get attention, I'll call on you and you can unmute yourself. So, who wants to present the first question or comment? Either to Greg or Stephen, or to the body as a whole.
Well, I'll go first.
Okay, Rosemary.
Well, thanks very much, Greg and Steve, for your presentations. I think what they brought out was the incredible range of Leo's intellectual thinking, abilities, the vast range of his thinking, which really affected us all. And both of you brought out so many aspects of his theoretical thinking. I just want to say, I first met Leo as an activist. I met Leo in 73, nearly 50 years ago. I met him driving from Ottawa to Toronto in a car. He joined our car ride to a waffle meeting. The waffle was the left-wing rump, shall I call it a rump, of the NDP, Canada's Social Democratic Party. And we were going to a meeting in Toronto, which was very much centered around the fact that the waffle was being kicked out of that Social Democratic Party. Now, Leo was never a member of the waffle, as he always liked to tell me when I mentioned this meeting. But he wanted to go, and he wanted to be there at this Social Democratic left-wing part of that party to really see where he had just come back from England the year before, and he wanted to see what was going on in terms of the activists, the Social Democratic activists and the socialists in that party, to see where the NDP was at. And then his activism continued on with us in Ottawa. Greg mentioned the Ottawa Committee for Labour Action. And when I was talking about Leo in another memorial here in Ottawa, what I remembered so clearly was the way in which he combined his intellectual thinking about social democracy, about unions, about the nation state and the relative autonomy of the state, to activism. And the pamphlets that we produced, he always managed incredibly, it seemed to me, to be able to bring those ideas into writing pamphlets, which we were going to go and distribute at outside workplaces, which I often wondered if it did anything. But despite that, those pamphlets were incredibly important for us in terms of our thinking. And I always remember at that time, what would it have been in 74, 75, the way in which he was pushing this idea of trade unions or labor movement, how the need to democratize not only the labor movement, but also the state, and the way in which part of that democratization was the recognition of the right to strike. And that continued on, I think, through his writings in terms of thinking about how do you democratize the state? How do you democratize the labor movement? How do you bring the working class into a more democratic relationship with the state? And of course, he influenced my work on unions incredibly, and I still can't believe he's gone. Anyhow, I just wanted to bring those earlier memories from Ottawa to this today.
Other comments? I'm checking the email. Nothing's come in there yet. Takes people a little time to formulate and then to type in their questions or comments. Having just listened to this July talk that Leo gave, are there things there that are prescient or that you would want to update? Because certainly, Greg and Stephen have both had conversations with him on these subjects since that.
The only thing I would probably observe is that the successive kind of defeats of Corbyn, Syriza, and to some extent Sanders, I think underpinned a little bit more of the pessimistic tone and how Leo was reading Trump and Trumpism and the possibilities for a really kind of sharp right-wing move, even capturing sections of the state in the last bit of his life. There was something kind of that moment that had opened up, that seemed to open up, with under, we can use that odd phrase, late neoliberalism, where the cracks were such that, new social forces were opening up. It left one in a relatively pessimistic mood, given that, those were the forces that seemed to open up. Hard to categorize Die Linke or Mélenchon or the left bloc in Portugal in the same line as the others. So there was kind of a certain kind of closure that was opening. So one had to, I think, reflect both on the greater opening that was possible on the right, and in a certain kind of authoritarian way that Leo had actually always backed off on. When we had done the book on the politics of the right in 2016, in the discussions we had, he was clearly, obviously observant of the authoritarian tendencies that had been inside neoliberalism and the way that they were sharpening and opening up spaces for a harder right. That was the point that we insisted against some opposition from the rest of the editorial group. Not strong opposition, but wondering if we were going too far, particularly me for insisting it was the time to do this. He kind of moved to a kind of more dramatic view of this. And I know Steve and he were having kind of dissenting arguments of how far to read the strength of the far right in the US and what space it had opened up. So that was kind of counterbalanced, I think, with his optimistic assessment that we still had to make claims for the positive things that had been emerging from the Sanders campaign, in particular the hopefulness he was insisting over the last year and a half over the numbers of young people that had been radicalized in Britain and the US from these campaigns. But I don't think that it was limited to that. It was also the way that the precarious work situations and some of the ecological issues, et cetera, were impacting a younger generation who was kind of finally finding a route of dissent towards neoliberalism that wasn't just taking the moment of protest, but it was also taking more overt political forms in terms of challenges to the state and challenges through the way that politics outside parliaments was also occurring.
I might just add a sentence or two to what Greg just said, because I think that really did sum up, I think, really well the last period of Leo's discussions and debates with those of us around him here in Toronto. What really Leo was concerned with and why he thought there was such an opening for a hard right kind of authoritarian turn in the American state or in the American society was because of the inability of capital, in his opinion, to potentially stop or preempt some hard right move that had some power within the coercive apparatuses like the military and especially the police. The inability of the capitalist class to be able to put the brakes on that effectively, not just in institutional terms, in the sense that the capitalist class has no institutional mechanism whereby it could intervene directly to call something like that off or to prevent it, but also because should things come to a head in that way, where there was actually on the agenda some kind of an authoritarian move by the hard right, backed by some part of the coercive apparatus, how far was the capitalist class actually willing to go, at least the biggest segments of it, to put the brakes on, even if they might not agree with it or might not see that as the most beneficial political arrangement compared to the several centuries now of American liberal democracy that has served elite interests quite well? how far would they actually be willing to go? Would you see, he would actually ask, would you see, Mark Zuckerberg walking on the streets arm in arm with left-wing demonstrators to prevent this coup or to prevent such an authoritarian turn from occurring? And so it was a kind of an awareness of this dangerous opening because of the nature of the relative autonomy of the state, that even though he would agree that the capitalist class was not pushing such a move and wouldn't even necessarily be immediately supportive of it, could they really put the brakes on institutionally? And also, how far were they actually willing to go to stand up for liberal democracy? At what point, as good gamblers, at what point would they start betting against liberal democracy as a stabilizing political institutional formation, and instead start gambling on throwing their lot in with something else that had gained enough steam to be a reasonable alternative, or to be a plausible alternative? By no means reasonable, of course. So yeah, that's kind of how he was seeing it, and I did have disagreements with that framing, as I think Greg did. But yeah.
If nobody liked a good joke and a good story of humor than Leo, if I might make some. During the pandemic in the summer, and then again, I think it was last week, I would go walking with Sam, and then last week again on the phone or something, he mentioned, what the hell's Leo doing? He's having me read these game choice theorists about how a coup could occur in the US under Trump. What the hell's he having me do? He was kind of even reading these scenarios by people on the right, and it was driving Sam crazy. And he was kind of, I can't figure him out. He's going way too far this time.
David, did you want to say something? You turned your camera on, I thought. Or Rosemary, unmute your mic.
I just wanted to put a question to Greg and Steve. The last time I saw Leo, which I think was last spring, maybe earlier, he said to me, socialism may not be possible. And it was it was just in passing, and I wanted to explore with him what he meant by that. And of course, you've given us some ideas about that today, but I just wanted you to say, if I'd explored that with him, what do you think he would have said that to me?
This is one of the areas where I ended up more optimistic than Leo on this big question. I would absolutely insist I didn't want to hear that argument, as opposed to the difficulties we were in right now. So it was the area, he would turn slightly pessimistic, and I'm not hearing that. I think maybe that was a bit of point of just putting something hard to set against and to clarify then and turn your own thinking. I think it then became it's a question more of time, and I think there, his setting against the that you simply can smash the state and find a route towards socialism, or you can simply elect a government and find a road to socialism, was the starting point of his. And I think the difference over time was that over time, over his thinking over the years was that this was not this was actually much more of a longer term issue than we had thought. It wasn't a matter of, you didn't have one blow but a series of blows that might extend over 10 or 15 years. But at the end of that 15 years, you would have had, a set of transformed institutions and rebuilt workers' capacities and visions, etc., allowed workers to flourish in a way that kind of would have opened up a socialist horizon in the way any of us think about it. And similarly, that, you could elect the same government over 2 or 3 terms, and at the end of the 3rd term, things were in place that no right-wing government could, shift things. I think mainly his time horizon about those things had shifted quite a bit. In that sense, I think was posing it less that I can't ever remember nothing at all ever would pass his mind of changing his political orientations about this, but time horizon. But as we all get older, part of that is what starts happening to all of us. You begin in your 20s. It's happening in my life, damn it, and I'm gonna make it happen. And then as you get older, and obviously now we're who would have ever thought in the 1980s we would be 40 years of into kind of a neoliberal kind of framework dominating politics and practices, state practices around the world to different forms and different degrees, and so your time horizon changes. I think the good part is with young people, I think was endearing Leo to them was not only the insistence that now is the time to keep moving in. It was also they're coupling that with the urgency in around climate change would also kind of put the kind of time horizons you had to think more directly immediately. But of course, the climate change also, as we all know and we're all worried about, is it also opens up authoritarian solutions to climate disaster if we can't find participatory forms of and collective forms of action to deal with climate global warming.
Yeah, I think Leo did at different times have doubts about whether socialism was a realistic outcome that we could expect to happen before there's some greater catastrophe. But I think that makes him a human being. I don't think that in any deeper way or fundamental way, Leo's commitment to living as if socialism was possible was shaken at all.
Yeah.
And that I think is really the key. He, in his most candid moments, of course, he did have doubts whether this was really a feasible thing we could expect to occur, as we all, I'm sure, do at different times. But, I think he was deeply committed and unshakably committed to living as if it was possible and to doing everything in his power to realize it, whatever that was and however limited that might have been. And so when I'm thinking back on Leo, when I'm thinking back on his last 1 to 2 years, I really do. This is what I was trying to describe in my comments earlier. I really do think there was a kind of tension going on that was not easily summarized as optimism of the intellect or optimism of the will. There was a much more complex tension going on in him between the will and the intellect, where he had willed himself, his commitment intellectually to this optimism of the intellect, to creatively finding these openings to changing the world possible, also meant a commitment of the will to maintaining that orientation. And at times, of course, people are like, geez, I have doubts, I have questions, but I think he had a commitment of the will first and foremost to maintaining that orientation to living as if socialism was possible and to maintaining that optimism of the intellect. And I never saw that shaken. I never saw that the deep fundamental core of him being committed to that project and to doing everything in his power to realizing that shaken.
Okay, Liz Mistress would like to speak.
Okay, I just wanted a brief remark. The last time I saw Leo was when he visited San Miguel last February. And I knew him and Melanie when they lived in New York for a brief period. And we got to know each other more personally than just occasional seminars. But one thing that we did when he was visiting in February was go to hear my favorite jazz musicians. And that was a big thing for Leo. And for me, which I assume is also for him, it's one of the sources of optimism in the creativity of human beings. So I just wanted to raise that because that was a big part of his interest as I understand it. So that's it. Oh, one more thing is, the other thing I remember very well is in 2002, right after the World Trade Center attack, I decided to go to the World Social Forum in Porto Alegre. And by some chance, I was talking to Leo and he was going too. So there was a group of us who went. It was a totally wonderful experience. And that forum has continued and gone back and forth, and it's nothing is linear, and it's like good and it just gets going. It goes back and forth. But that was an experience I had with him. I just wanted to highlight. That's it.
Are there others who,
Maybe I'll just comment on Liz. Over the years around politics, when you're just trying to create politics in this difficult space we've been existing in Canada for a long time, the one thing that Leo was always kind of committed to working on was things that dealt with the trade union movement, where you could actually fight the leadership or fight the company. And then he would plunge into the struggle. You could kind of gauge in something where you're really able to push the leadership and there was space to the left, he would really engage it. He didn't kind of like the day-to-day other stuff of trade union support or solidarity work, particularly in our own union. But at that level, he wouldn't in particular have had a company. The other thing I always found over the years, which he was consistently interested in, was actually doing cultural work and cultural support work, and kind of doing that work. And our political group here in Ottawa, in Toronto, is something he was always keen on supporting, and did a lot of work on kind of trying to pull a cultural committee together and putting on events and trying to find this other kind of culture. I think it was actually, that was also, as Rosemary was pointing out at different points in time, was also a theoretical and cultural committee. One of the things that I remember from first learning with, studying with them and learning, and then part of the political groups in and around Ottawa, was Leo's own emphasis on Raymond Williams's work, and Raymond Williams's work on culture and as something that had to be part of reforming a working class formation. And he was very much influenced by that approach to thinking about what making a new working class politics would be. And one of the things that he was constantly committed to doing at a personal individual level of supporting that work.
well, this has been an interesting discussion. We've gone way over time. And I think we probably should wrap it up now with immense thanks to Greg and Steve for sharing with us their insights. Now, today's webinar, as well as past programs, are available on YouTube and accessible from our website, globaljusticecenter.org. Next week, as a change of pace, we will be looking at cooperatives, worker-owned co-ops. We will have as our guests Mark Dworkin and Melissa Young, who will be screening for us their film, Shift Change, Putting Democracy to Work. And they will be available to discuss their film, along with Esteban Kelly of the U.S. Federation of Co-ops. So that's what's coming up next Monday at 1 o'clock Central Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Time. Hope that you'll join us then. For now, let me thank our team here at the Center for Global Justice that has put these webinars together. There's Gregory Diamant, Liz Mestras, Roberto Robles, Olivia Canales. Thank you so much for your efforts. And this is Cliff Duran signing off for now.
Well, thank you. That was great.